Hello and welcome back to this series on lessons in the wilderness. And last week we were looking at the time that the Israelites spent in the wilderness of Sinai and the underlying lesson of holiness. How can a holy God relate to unholy people? This was the establishment of a personal relationship with the Lord their God and how they should act to enable them to be in his presence. The time in the wilderness of Sinai transformed them, or at least it started that transformation. But now they were on the move once more. So the Israelites set out from the wilderness of Sinai and travelled on from place to place until the cloud stopped in the wilderness of Paran. So by now they've got a column of fire by night and a column of cloud by day to be leading them on, guiding them. Now, as we've been seeing, the Lord used the wildernesses along their journey not only to teach them, but to form them into the nation, the holy nation that they were destined to be. So why has the Lord brought them now to the wilderness of Paran? Well, Paran in Hebrew means to glorify, to beautify, to adorn. This was the place, after the lessons that the Lord had taught the Israelites in the wildernesses of Shur, of Sin, of Sinai, where he should have been able to gather his people and enjoy a close, glorious relationship with them in preparation for them to enter into the promised land. This would only have been less than 2 years since they left Egypt. But this place of glory, of beauty, of adornment became the place of grumbling, of jealousy, of failure. This is the place that it all went horribly wrong. So this all starts in Numbers chapter 11. Verse 1 says, "The people soon began to complain to the Lord about their hardships, and when the Lord heard them, his anger blazed against them." What hardships? Well, the passage doesn't elaborate on that, and the reason for that most probably is that it's all too petty to even waste papyrus and ink on. The Lord had freed them from captivity in Egypt, had brought them through the wilderness of Shur, where he miraculously provided them with water, had brought them through the wilderness of Sin, where he'd miraculously provided them with food, a feast of quail, an ongoing provision of manna. And he'd taken them to the wilderness of Sinai, where he had declared his intentions to them by giving them the law and by providing a means by which an unholy people could be in the presence of a holy God. All this he had done for them. And now, as soon as they were on the move again, the people soon began to complain. So the Lord sent them a warning shot. Fire from the Lord raged among them and destroyed the outskirts of the camp. Numbers 11 verse 1 says. Did they learn their lesson? Well, hardly. It just gave way to more grumbling. You see, first came the grumbling of the rabble. Now, there were, broadly speaking, two groups of people in the crowd of people who escaped from Egypt: the Israelites and what was called the rabble. The rabble were most likely Egyptians who had converted to Judaism and who'd left Egypt with the Israelites. Exodus 12 verse 38 says that many people who were not Israelites went with them along with flocks and herds. It's possible that they were other foreign workers conscripted to work in the land of Egypt. But one thing is for sure, they weren't Israelites, and as such they weren't part of the promise. They weren't the chosen people. They inflated the numbers, but when it came down to it, they weren't the committed core. You know, one of the lessons that has come out of this pandemic is that according to some recent Barna research data that tracks the church attendance patterns of Christians and the general population during 2020 against a pre-pandemic benchmark shows some dramatic changes in church attendance patterns and attitudes. 22% of churched adults have stopped attending in-person or digital church. Now, what this says is that numbers aren't everything, and they can in fact be a distraction. And at some stage, that distraction, if you let it, is going to work against the Lord's purposes. Here in the wilderness of Paran, the Egyptians among them were viewing things rather differently to the Israelites who were headed towards the first real home they had ever known. The Egyptians already had a home, and now they were remembering back to their culture and their background and their shared history. The Israelites were heading towards home, whereas the Egyptians were heading away from home. Then the foreign rabble who were traveling with the Israelites began to crave the good things of Egypt. And the people of Israel also began to complain. "Oh, for some meat," they exclaimed. "We remember all the fish we used to eat for free in Egypt. And we had all the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions and garlic that we wanted. But now our appetites are gone, and day after day we had nothing to eat but this manna," it says in Numbers 11, verses 4 to 6. The grumbling of the rabble quickly spread to the Israelites, and very soon everyone was moaning and demanding meat to eat. So, like before, God caused a huge flock of quail to fly into the camp. But he also caused a severe plague to break out while the people were eating the quail, and many died. So, between the fire that God sent and the severe plague that he sent, the rabble were fairly wiped out. You don't hear of them again after this. Certainly, it seems to be a refining time in the nation of Israel. So that was the grumbling of the rabble. But then there was the grumbling of Aaron and Miriam. If the first lot of grumbling was because of a lack of buy-in to the vision, the second lot of grumbling was from good old-fashioned jealousy. Aaron and Miriam were brother and sister, and Miriam is described in Exodus chapter 15 and verse 20 as a prophet. They seized the opportunity of this turmoil with the foreigners in their midst to criticize Moses for having married an Ethiopian woman. What we today call Ethiopia was in those days called the land of Cush. While they were in Hazeroth, Miriam and Aaron criticized Moses because he had married a Cushite woman, says Numbers 12 verse 1. Now, it's not clear who the Cushite woman is. Some commentators say that it's Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, whom Moses married while he was living in Midian after fleeing Egypt because he'd killed an Egyptian. Other commentators say that it's a separate woman whom Moses took as a second wife. The Bible isn't clear. In my opinion, I think she was a second wife whom Moses married, probably after the death of Zipporah. Numbers 12 verse 1 wouldn't make a lot of sense in terms of Miriam and Aaron criticizing Moses for marrying a Cushite woman if that woman was Zipporah, because that seems to indicate a recent event, whereas Moses and Zipporah had been married for over 40 years by that time. However, what is clear is that she wasn't a native Israelite. Why was that a problem for Aaron and Miriam at this moment in time? Because it comes hot on the heels of the grumbling of the foreigners amongst them and the fire and the plague-ridden quail. In other words, there was a real anti-foreigner sentiment among the people. Obviously, God is angry with them because they're foreigners and he's killing them off. And so why has Moses just gone and married one? Aaron and Miriam are caught up in this sense of keep the foreigners out. But are they really just concerned for the purity of Israelite blood? Was it really that they were worried about people intermarrying with foreigners? See, I don't think so. I think their true motive is laid bare in the very next verse. They said, has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Hasn't he spoken through us too? That's Numbers 12 verse 2. See, Moses might have just married a Cushite, an Ethiopian, but the real reason for their upset was not so much that as a sense of Moses seems to think he can live however he wants to and play fast and loose with following the rules and then expect to still be blessed by the Lord. Well, what about us? We've kept the rules. We've been good Jews. How come we aren't blessed and given that special relationship with God that he has? It's not fair. And that is precisely the parable of the prodigal son, isn't it? Meanwhile, the older son was in the fields working, and when he returned home, he heard music and dancing in the house, and he asked one of the servants what was going on. Your brother is back, he was told, and your father has killed the calf we were fattening and has prepared a great feast. We're celebrating because of his safe return. The older brother was angry and wouldn't go in. His father came out and begged him. But he replied, all these years I've worked hard for you and never once refused to do a single thing that you told me to do. And in all that time, you never gave me even one young goat for a feast with my friends. Yet when this son of yours comes back after squandering your money on prostitutes, you celebrate by killing the finest calf that we have. You can read that in Luke 15, verses 25 to 30. Despite being rescued and protected and loved by the Lord, Miriam and Aaron still acted like the older son. The older son will never be ready to be blessed by the father. His heart is reserved for those who act like the younger son. Well, that was the grumbling of Aaron and Miriam, but then there was the grumbling of the 10 spies, followed by, well, the grumbling of everyone. See, by now the Israelites were settled in their camp in the wilderness of Paran. And the Lord said to Moses, send men to explore the land of Canaan, the land I'm giving to Israel. Send one leader from each of the 12 ancestral tribes. You can see that in Numbers 13, verse 2. God had dealt with the grumbling of the foreigners in their midst by sending fire. He's dealt with the grumbling of Miriam and Aaron by sending leprosy on Miriam. Anyone with even a grain of insight should have been able to see that God is raising the stakes. He might have forgiven grumbling in times past, but he expects them to have learned the lessons by now, because this is the moment when they should be ready to move into the promised land. After 2 years of travel, of learning the lessons of Shur, of Sin, of Sinai, and just recently of the grumbling of the rabble and of Aaron and Miriam, they should be ready for this all-important step of faith. And yet, of course, they weren't. The wilderness of Paran, the place of glory, of beauty, of adornment, should really have been called the wilderness of grumbling. All of the spies came back reporting the following. We arrived in the land you sent us to see, and it is indeed a magnificent country, a land flowing with milk and honey. Here is some of its fruit as proof. But the people living there are powerful, and their cities and towns are fortified and very large. We also saw the descendants of Anak who are living there. The Amalekites live in the Negev, and the Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country. Although Caleb and Joshua tried to encourage the people that this is doable, The other 10 spies spread a very damaging report, saying that all the people in the land were giants and the land would swallow them up. The response of the people just demonstrates the power of grumbling. Then all the people began weeping aloud, and they cried all night. Their voices rose in a great chorus of complaint against Moses and Aaron, says Numbers 14, verses 1 and 2. Unchecked grumbling and negativity will always overpower the positive. And the Lord realized there is still grumbling and complaining in the camp. And do you know the sad truth about that grumbling and complaining? It was completely unnecessary. They were afraid of the people living in the land, assuming that they would be completely overwhelmed by them. What they failed to appreciate is that the people in the land were likewise terrified of the Israelites. Listen to what one resident of that land says 40 years later when the group of spies are sent in. She says this, "I know that the Lord has given you this land," she told them. "We are all afraid of you. Everyone is living in terror, for we have heard how the Lord made a dry path for you through the Red Sea when you left Egypt. And we know what you did to Sihon and Og, the two Amorite kings east of the Jordan River, whose people you completely destroyed. No wonder our hearts have melted in fear. No one has the courage to fight after hearing such things." That's in Joshua chapter 2, verses 9 to 11. And we Christians have exactly the same problem today. We aren't defeated by the giants in the land. We're defeated by the giants in our minds. We're defeated by something that one person called Viktor Frankl once said. Fear makes come true that which one is afraid of. Fear makes come true that which one is afraid of. The grumbling of the rabble, the grumbling of Aaron and Miriam, the grumbling of the 10 spies, and the grumbling of the people in general, they all spring from the same source: a lack of trust in God and in who He has created us to be. And because of that, God turned them around and sent them off, not to the promised land, but to the wilderness of Zin, where they would spend the following 38 years. But God was not finished with them yet. The wilderness of Zin, as we shall see, represents the patience of God as He started the process of rebuilding them as a nation, as His chosen, called, holy people. And God hasn't finished with His church yet either. He is still building us, growing us, refining us. We may not be in the promised land yet, but the wilderness of Zin doesn't last forever. The wilderness of Paran revealed to the Israelites and reveals to us as well that the core fundamental question that God asks is, do you trust me? We so often struggle to say yes and actually live accordingly. But nevertheless, God still says, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. That's Deuteronomy 31, verse 6. He is not finished yet, and neither are we. And Lord, that really was a case of so near and yet so far. As the Israelites are in the wilderness of Paran, on the brink of their destiny, ready to be adorned with God's glory and sent into the promised land, that land flowing with milk and honey, and yet failing the test of trust and succumbing to grumbling, expecting the worst, seeing the negatives. And so they had to spend the next 38 years in the wilderness of Zin. Lord, how tragic that on the very brink of success, in the very jaws of success, they snatched defeat. And how tragic it is for us who have been blessed so richly, who have been rescued, redeemed, who have been saved by your work, Jesus on the cross, who are now citizens of heaven, who have eternity awaiting them in eternal relationship in heaven. How sad it is, Lord, that we still live defeated, grumbling lives. Lord, have mercy upon us. Lord, would you fill our hearts with the reality of who we are, that we may say, Lord, I trust you. I am a citizen of heaven. I am rescued. I am redeemed. I am forgiven. I am now a citizen of heaven. And so I trust you, Lord. Lord, would you rescue us from grumbling? Would you rescue us from doubting? Would you rescue us from wanting to go back rather than pressing on forwards into the purposes that you have for us? Would you help us to learn the lessons from the wilderness of Paran? That you want to bless us, to adorn us, to bring beauty for ashes. You're not here to watch over our defeat. You're here to bless us with far more than we can ever ask or imagine. Turn our hearts, Lord, towards trust in you, I pray. And I ask it in Jesus' amazing name. Amen. Well, I hope you can join us next time as we look at the lessons to be learned from the next wilderness that the Israelites find themselves in, as God seeks to make them a people fit for the promised land. And of course, he seeks to make us a people fit for heaven. Yes, we have been saved. And yes, we are being saved. We're being made holy, made into the likeness of Christ. We're being sanctified through all of these processes in our lives. Join us next time as we look at the next wilderness together.